Let your body sink into the quiet. Whatever the day held, you can set it down now. Come with me, gently, into the calm, unhurried world of Socrates and his search for justice. If these help you sleep, subscribe. I post a new one every night. The smell reaches you before anything else. Bread, warm and faintly charred at the edges, carried on air that is already thick with the heat of a Mediterranean morning. Then the sound of a dispute, not angry, not yet, but moving in that direction. Two voices rising over the price of something, the particular half-theatrical indignation of a merchant who has been offered less than he asked, and is performing his offense before he accepts. And beneath that, lower and continuous, the sound of the city breathing, feet on stone, the creak of a cart being pulled over uneven ground, the sudden bright cascade of a dropped vessel hitting the earth and breaking, and then laughter from somewhere nearby, from someone who did not drop it. This is the agora at midday in the 5th century, before the Common Era. It is not a quiet place, and it is not a simple one. The stalls have been arranged since before sunrise. Olives, pottery, fish from the harbor at Piraeus, bolts of cloth dyed in the particular deep colors that wealthy Athenians prefer, wine sealed in amphorae, stacked against the low walls of the surrounding buildings. The air holds all of it at once, the salt and the bread and the animal warmth of a crowd that has not yet thinned in the afternoon heat. People press close without ceremony. A woman bargains for herbs. A man with the build of someone who works with his hands argues with another man who clearly does not. A soldier, recently returned from somewhere, stands at the edge of the stoa with the particular stillness of someone whose body has not yet fully remembered that it is safe. At the center of the agora, if you were to find your eye drawn there is nothing remarkable to see. A fountain, some stone benches, the movement of people past and through and around one another in the ordinary choreography of a city that has been doing this for a very long time. Commerce and argument share the same air here. No fence separates the man buying fish from the man asking his companion whether justice is something a city practices or something a person practices, and whether the two can ever be the same. Both conversations are happening within earshot. Neither interrupts the other. Athens in this period holds itself in a particular self-regard, and it has some reason to. The democratic reforms that had restructured its civic life in the generations before had given it a model of collective self-governance that was genuinely new in the world's experience, a form of political life in which citizens gathered to speak, to vote, and to decide, in which the assembly was not the instrument of a king, but the voice of the people themselves. The word for it was demokratia, the power of the demos, the people, and the pride that came with it was not merely decorative. It was woven into the way the city understood itself, the way it built its buildings and staged its festivals and inscribed its laws in stone for anyone who could read to see. What was also woven in, running parallel and quieter, was a set of arrangements so familiar they had ceased to feel like arrangements at all. The demos whose power the city celebrated was not everyone who lived there. Women did not participate in the assembly. Slaves, and there were many, in a ratio that later historians would note, with the careful detachment of people recording a climate, had no standing in the legal system that governed their lives. Medics, the foreign residents who might have lived in Athens for decades, who contributed to its commerce and its crafts and its intellectual life, were excluded from the political community whose ideals they helped to sustain. The carved inscriptions about virtue and civic excellence passed daily over the heads of people who were not invited to practice them, whose lives ran alongside the celebrated life of the city, without ever being included in it. This was not invisible to everyone who lived inside it, but it was rarely framed as the central problem. The distance between the ideal and the arrangement was held in the same frame, acknowledged and set aside, the way a beautiful piece of music can be acknowledged and set aside. You hear it, you know it is there, and you continue with what you were doing. The agora in the morning contains all of this simultaneously: the genuine democratic energy, the actual exclusions, the argument about fish prices, and the conversation about justice, all of it moving through the same warm air without resolution. In the shade of the stoa, a group of young men is gathered. They are well dressed, which means their families have money, which means their families have interests to protect and ambitions to advance in the city's political life. The man at the center of the group speaks with practiced ease, moving through an argument the way someone moves through a house they know very well. He is not a citizen in the old sense. This teacher, he has come from elsewhere, drawn by the city's appetite for clever speech, and he charges handsomely for what he offers. What he offers is not truth. It is something more practical than truth. It is the ability to make any position sound persuasive, to win an argument before an assembly or a jury, regardless of which side of it you are standing on, to appear to know what justice is, without having to submit to the difficult and unrewarding labor of finding out. His name might be Protagoras, or one of a dozen others who came to Athens in this period with similar offerings. Protagoras had said, in the clearest version of the position, that man is the measure of all things, that what is true for you is true, and what is true for another person is equally true for them, and that the question of which of you is right, in some deeper sense, beyond your respective perceptions, is a question without a genuine answer. The wind feels cold to the person who is ill. It does not feel cold to the person who is well. Both reports are accurate. Both are true. There is no temperature of the wind itself, no fact of the matter apart from the one each perceiving person encounters. And if this is true of wind and cold, it may be true of justice too, which means that what a city calls just is what that city has decided to call just, and that decision reflects the interests of whoever made it, and there is nothing more to say. The young men in the shade write this down on their wax tablets. Their styluses move with the attention of people learning a skill they expect to use. What they are learning is not how to find a true answer to the question of what justice is. They are learning how to sound as if they have found it, which in an assembly of several thousand citizens is a more directly useful thing to know. The sophists, as the teachers of persuasive skill were called, sold this knowledge openly, without embarrassment, for large sums. They regarded it as a service. The city had a need. They met the need. The transaction was clean. It was not clean, though, or at least this was a view held with some force by the people who looked at it most steadily. The difficulty was this: when philosophy becomes a product, the philosopher becomes answerable not to truth, but to the satisfaction of the buyer. And a buyer who wants to win arguments, not to find truth, will pay for what they want, which means the teacher who wishes to continue being paid will teach them how to win arguments, not how to find truth. The original question, what justice is, what a good life looks like, what a city owes to the people it governs, gets displaced by a second question that sounds similar. How do I appear to know the answer to that first question well enough to get what I want from other people? And the displacement is very quiet. It happens inside the form of philosophical inquiry while draining out the substance. The styluses continue to move. The wax tablets fill up with arguments. The question of what justice actually is remains where it was. Protagoras' declaration, man is the measure of all things, was genuinely interesting as a philosophical position, and it is not entirely wrong. It names something real about the way perception works, about the way moral and political judgments are always made from somewhere, by someone, with a particular history and a particular set of interests and a particular set of experiences that shape what they are able to see. There is no view from nowhere, and the philosopher who pretends otherwise is not more honest than the sophist, only more self-deceived. But the position runs into a difficulty when it is pressed all the way to its conclusion. If every perspective is equally valid, if there is no fact of the matter beyond what each measurer measures, then the question of how a city should treat its weakest members, its slaves, its women, its foreigners, has no correct answer. It is simply a question of whose measurement carries the force to impose itself on everyone else. And the city that imposes its measurement is not more just than the city that imposes a different one. It is simply stronger. This was not an abstract worry in Athens during these decades. The Peloponnesian War, the long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that ground through the latter part of the 5th century, had done something to the moral atmosphere of the city that later observers would note with precision. War does not always make a city harder to live in at the level of daily philosophy. Sometimes it makes the philosophical questions more urgent rather than less, because the cost of getting them wrong has become visible in a way that peace can sometimes obscure. But the Peloponnesian War seems to have done something else in Athens. It had made a certain kind of moral honesty, or moral frankness, or moral cynicism, depending on how you hold it, more comfortable to express out loud. The most documented instance of this frankness appears in an episode that the historian Thucydides recorded with the care of someone who understood that what he was writing down was not simply a diplomatic exchange, but a document of what power looks like when it stops performing virtue. In the 16th year of the war, Athenian envoys arrived at the island of Melos, a small island that had tried to remain neutral in the conflict. The envoys were there to demand submission. The Melians argued, with a kind of dignified steadiness, that justice was on their side, and that the gods favor the just, and that Sparta would come to their aid. The Athenian envoys acknowledged the argument and set it aside. What they offered instead was a principle: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is not a moral claim, it is a description, and its purpose was to strip away the language of justice entirely and replace it with the language of power, openly, without disguise. Thucydides recorded all of this. He sat with the account of the exchange and set it down in the way a physician sets down a symptom, precisely, without flinching, without the annotation that it was wrong. The physician who records a symptom does not cause the illness, but the precision of the record implies something about the symptom, that it is real, that it happened, that it is worth looking at directly. Thucydides had been a general. He had watched Athens make decisions. He may have known, in the way that close observers of power sometimes know things they cannot prove and would not claim, that the declaration the Athenian envoys made to the Melians was not a departure from Athenian political philosophy, but an unusually honest expression of it. Melos was destroyed. Its men were killed. Its women and children were sold into slavery. This was documented and moved past because the war continued and there were other things to record. But the exchange itself, the words spoken in that meeting before the outcome was decided, persisted in the written account, a clean and terrible argument, framed not as villainy, but as realism. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. The agora in the morning has absorbed this, the way a city absorbs everything that has happened in its history, not as a wound exactly, because the wound has been closed over with daily life, with the price of fish and the sound of the fountain, and the well-dressed young men writing down arguments on their wax tablets. But the absorption does not mean the thing is gone. It is there in the way the question of justice circulates, in the particular edge on the word, when it is used in the assembly, in the slight tightening that passes through a crowd of citizens, when they hear it argued that justice is simply what benefits the stronger party, because they have heard that argument before, and they know that it was not only an argument, it was also once a policy. The stone benches of the assembly hall are empty now. It is midday, and the business of the morning has concluded. But the worn, smooth quality of the stone carries its own kind of record, the pressure of 10,000 decisions, each one made by citizens who believed themselves to be enacting justice, and who could not, when pressed, always agree on what that word contained. They voted on war and voted on peace. They voted on the fate of other cities. They voted on which of their own citizens should be celebrated and which should be exiled. They voted on what justice required in each case, and the votes were binding, and they did not always look the same from the outside as they looked from the inside, where the assembled citizens felt themselves to be doing what a just city does when it governs itself. The sophists watching this assembly had a coherent explanation for why the votes went the way they went: rhetoric. The citizen who could speak persuasively, who could arrange his words in the order that moved the assembled crowd toward the conclusion he wanted, had power that the citizen with better reasons but less practiced speech did not. The assembly was not a mechanism for finding the true answer to questions of justice. It was a mechanism for discovering what the best available speaker could make the majority believe. And since truth and persuasion do not always align, since the true account of a situation is not always the one that feels most satisfying to hear, the assembly was, from this view, a somewhat elaborate and beautiful machine for producing outcomes that had the form of collective wisdom and not always the substance. This was a difficult thing to say out loud in Athens, because Athens was genuinely proud of its democracy. The pride was not entirely misplaced. There was something real in the practice of collective deliberation, something that did not exist in the political arrangements of the cities that surrounded Athens, something that acknowledged, however imperfectly, however selectively, that the people who live under a set of rules have some claim on the making of those rules. But the sophist critique did not go away just because the institution it was aimed at deserved some respect. The question of whether a city was producing justice, or producing the appearance of justice, or producing what the best rhetorician could make the majority comfortable believing, was a question that the institution itself could not answer from inside. There was also, alongside the philosophical commerce of the sophists and the formal machinery of the assembly, a more informal practice of inquiry happening in the same agora where the bread sellers and the fish merchants did their work. The agora was not only a marketplace for goods, it was the primary site of the city's intellectual life in its daily, unorganized form, the place where citizens encountered each other, where ideas circulated without the formal structure of a lecture or the political structure of a vote, where someone could stop someone else in the course of an ordinary morning and ask them a question they had been carrying for some time. The stone benches at its edges were places where people sat and talked. The shade of the stoa was where the more extended conversations happened. The whole space was porous, permeable, open in the way that markets tend to be open to anyone who had a reason to be there, which in a city of this kind was almost everyone. The question of justice moved through this space daily. It was not always called that. It might wear the form of an argument about who had been treated unfairly by a neighbor, or a dispute about what a contract required, or a debate about whether the city's decision to go to war with such and such island had been the right one, but beneath the specific arguments, the persistent question, what does it mean to treat someone as they ought to be treated, and where does that standard come from, and who gets to say? The city needed this question answered in order to function. Its courts needed it, its assembly needed it, its families needed it, and no one had managed to answer it in a way that held still long enough to be built on. In the wealthier houses above the commercial district, the question took on a different flavor. A rich father with sons approaching the age of political participation would pay a sophist to teach those sons the art of speaking well in public, the techniques by which an argument can be made to sound more compelling than it is, the methods by which a crowd can be moved in a desired direction. This was, from a certain angle, not so different from sending a son to learn navigation or medicine, a practical skill, valuable in the world as the world actually was, useful for protecting the family's interests in a political environment where the ability to persuade had the force of law. The father might have had no particular philosophical views about whether justice was real or merely conventional. What he knew was that his son would one day need to stand before the assembly, and the assembly responded to rhetoric, and rhetoric could be taught. The problem was that what could be taught, the technique, the skill, the practiced ease with which an argument could be assembled and delivered, was entirely separable from the question of whether the argument was true. A skilled rhetorician could make a just argument persuasively. He could also make an unjust argument persuasively. The skill does not know the difference. It is a tool, and like all tools, it can be used in more than one direction. And in a city where political success depended on rhetorical skill, the incentive was not to find the true answer to the question of justice and then learn to speak it clearly. The incentive was to learn to speak clearly, whatever position would benefit the speaker most, and to do it well enough that the distinction between truth and performance was not visible to the audience. Thucydides, writing his history not as a celebration but as a record, set the Melian dialogue down in the full awareness that what the Athenian envoys had said was a kind of conclusion. The conclusion that the sophist's relativism and the politician's pragmatism arrived at when they were followed all the way to their end. If justice is only what the powerful define it to be, and if the purpose of political skill is to secure what you want from people who have less power than you, then the conversation with the Melians was not a moral failure, but a logical outcome. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. This is not a breakdown of the system. This is the system working as a system works when it has no principle outside itself to check against. The slave carrying water through the corridor of a fine house passes beneath carvings of civic virtue without either irony or resentment, or at least without resentment that the record preserves. The day is ordinary. The water is heavy. The carving has been there for longer than the slave has been in this house, and it will be there after. It depicts a figure in the posture of courage, or wisdom, or civic devotion, one of the virtues that the city celebrated in stone, because it believed, or wanted to believe, that the city practiced them. The distance between the carved ideal and the carried water is not marked in any ledger. It is held in the same frame, with the quietness of things that have been this way long enough to feel like weather. And in the agora, the morning continues. The bread seller tears a piece from a warm loaf and hands it across the stall. The merchant who was arguing about prices has settled the dispute, or decided to continue it later. The young men in the shade of the stoa have filled their wax tablets and are beginning to discuss among themselves what they have written down, testing the arguments on each other the way young people do when they have been given permission to think of themselves as the sort of people who have arguments worth testing. The fountain catches the light. The stone of the surrounding buildings holds the heat. Somewhere in this space, not yet pointed at, but present in the questions already circulating, in the sophist teaching and the assembly's debates, and the historical record of what the strong do when they have the power to do it. Somewhere in all of this, a question waits. It is not a new question. It is as old as the city, and probably older. It is the question of whether justice is a real thing, not a convention, not a mask the powerful wear when performing benevolence, not a technique the rhetorician employs when the audience prefers the appearance of fairness, but a real thing, something that holds true regardless of who is measuring and what they stand to gain from the measurement. The sophists had an answer: no. Or at least no in the sense that matters. There is no standard outside human preference and convention to which the question can be referred. The Athenian envoys at Melos had an answer that was not philosophical, but was perhaps more honest. The question is not whether justice is real. The question is whether you have the strength to impose your version of it. And if you do not, the question becomes irrelevant. Thucydides, sitting alone somewhere with his account of the Melian dialogue, recorded the exact words by which power justified itself to itself, the way a careful physician records a symptom with precision. He did not add a commentary saying this was wrong. He did not need to. The precision of the record is its own kind of moral act. To write down exactly what was said is to preserve it for the future, where it will be read by people who can look at it from outside the moment of its saying, who can see what it is without the pressure of a war making the choices feel inevitable. He wrote it and set it down, and it entered the world as a document. The claim that justice is what the powerful arrange, that the weak suffer what the powerful will not prevent, that between cities as between people where there is no equal strength, there is no real question of right, was already in the air of Athens long before anyone had tried systematically to answer it. It moved through the agora with the same ease as the smell of bread and the sound of a dispute at a merchant's stall. It was in the assembly's arguments. It was in the sophist's teaching. It was in the unspoken structure of a city that celebrated collective justice while its arrangements ran in a different direction. The claim was not a fringe position. It was not spoken only by the cynical or the corrupt. It was spoken in different forms and with different degrees of explicitness by serious people who had looked at the world carefully and drawn the conclusion that the world offered. And the question of whether that conclusion could be answered, whether the claim that justice was only power rearranged could be met with something more than a counter-assertion, whether there was somewhere to stand outside the arrangements of the powerful from which the question could be asked again and answered differently, that question had not yet found the form it needed to be properly pursued. It was there, in the air, moving through the same warm morning space where bread was sold and disputes were settled and well-dressed young men learned the art of appearing to know things they had not taken the trouble to find out. Whether it could be answered was not certain. Whether the city's founding claim that self-governance and collective deliberation were capable of producing something genuinely just, not merely something that the strongest voices in the assembly preferred, whether that claim could be defended against the Athenian envoys' clear-eyed account of what power does when it can do what it wants, this was the question the agora carried. Without urgency, without resolution, the way a lamp carries light, not as a solution to the darkness, but as a small persistent fact inside it, present at the edge of where the darkness thickens, burning without demanding that anything be done about what it illuminates. He was standing still. That is the first thing anyone noticed. In a city that moved constantly, where the agora hummed with the particular noise of a place that believed its own activity was meaningful. Socrates stood the way stones stand, not planted against anything, not braced, simply present in the way that things with deep roots are present. His feet were bare on the warm stone. His chiton was the kind that had been washed many times and had arrived at a color that was no particular color at all. He was not watching anything in the way a man watches when he is waiting for something to happen. He was watching the way a man watches who has nowhere else to be and no particular expectation of what the morning will produce. The agora was already filling. The sellers of figs and dried fish had arranged their goods on low wooden boards. A man was arguing with another man over a weight, and the argument had the quality of an argument that had been rehearsed many times before, and would be rehearsed many times again, without either party conceding anything they could not afford to concede. Children cut between the adults without apology. Somewhere behind the stoas, a goat was making itself heard. The smell of wood smoke and warm bread moved across the square with the early morning air, settling briefly, then lifting. Socrates watched all of this with the patience of someone who had understood, sometime in his middle years, that the world produces an inexhaustible supply of exactly this kind of morning. The noise would not sharpen into anything in particular. The argument over the weight would conclude without resolution. The day would proceed. He was not waiting for a better morning. He was simply present in the one that had arrived. What happened next would happen most mornings. In one form or another, someone would walk past who held a belief. Not always a belief about something philosophical, often a belief about something practical and ordinary, about the right conduct of a trial, about what courage required in a particular situation, about which of two men deserved a public office. And Socrates would ask with genuine curiosity what exactly the person meant, not with the sharpened intention of a man who has already found the flaw and is waiting to reveal it, with the specific quality of attention that comes from a person who actually wants to know. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to misread. The questions Socrates asked did not feel, at first, like the beginning of anything difficult. They had the texture of ordinary conversation between people who are sharing a space and passing the time. They arrived without ceremony. A general would emerge from the assembly feeling confident in the morning's decisions, and Socrates would fall into step beside him, and within a few minutes he would be asking, with that unhurried interest, what courage actually was. Not whether the general was courageous, not whether the decisions had required courage. What courage was in itself, if the general could say. The general usually would say something reasonable, something that drew on a long experience of battle and command, something that in any ordinary conversation would have been accepted, noted, and moved past. Socrates would consider it carefully, and then he would ask whether that definition included certain cases the general had perhaps not yet considered. The sun was not yet high when these conversations began. They lasted long enough that by the time they ended, the agora was in a different phase of its daily life entirely. What Socrates was practicing had a shape that could be described, although he was cautious about describing it. The practice began with an invitation, not always phrased as one, but always structurally that, to define something: courage, piety, justice, virtue itself. The interlocutor would offer a definition, usually with some confidence, because the words were familiar and the concepts had been used many times, and in most daily conversations they worked well enough. Socrates would receive the definition with what appeared to be respect, and would then begin to ask about it, not to attack it, not yet, to understand it more fully. The questions were specific, careful, and patient. Did the definition include this case? Did it exclude that one? Was the property identified in the definition actually present in all the cases the interlocutor had said it was present in, and only in those cases? Was there perhaps a more precise way to draw the boundary? The definition would be refined, adjusted, qualified. It would become more careful, more hedged, more technically exact, and then sometimes slowly, sometimes with a speed that left the interlocutor without any clear sense of where the ground had gone. The more careful definition would reveal its own internal contradictions. Two properties that had seemed to go together would turn out to separate under close examination. A boundary that had seemed clear would dissolve when a hard case was pressed against it. The concept that had been familiar for decades would become, under the light of very patient questioning, something the interlocutor could no longer hold steady. There is a Greek word for the state this produces. It is aporia. It means roughly a roadblock, an impasse, a place where the path runs out and the traveler stands not knowing which direction contains a way forward. The politicians Socrates talked to found this state unpleasant because they were accustomed to being regarded as men who knew things. The poets he questioned found it distressing for related reasons. Even the craftsmen, the potters and the cobblers and the builders, who genuinely did know their specific trades with real technical mastery, found that their practical expertise had not prepared them for this particular kind of not knowing. Socrates found it valuable. He found it, in fact, the most important thing a conversation could produce. This requires some explaining, because it is a position that feels strange at first. The conversations that ended in aporia did not feel to the people inside them like success. They felt like arrival at a place where the road had been washed away. The interlocutor who had walked in certain of what piety meant walked out without a definition that could withstand examination. That seems on its surface like a loss. The person knows less at the end than at the beginning, or at least believes they do. What has been gained? What has been gained, Socrates believed, is the beginning of something real. The person who walked in with a definition of piety that satisfied them was not, Socrates thought, in possession of actual knowledge of piety. They were in possession of a belief that had never been seriously tested. The belief had been working in the way that a bridge over a shallow ditch works, reliably enough for most crossings, never examined for the qualities that would matter if the ditch were deeper. Aporia was the discovery that the ditch was, in fact, much deeper than it had appeared. The bridge was still there, but the examination of what the bridge was built from and whether it would hold had begun. That examination was, in Socrates' view, the only honest way to approach the real depth of the question. He described what he was doing on at least one occasion that has been recorded as something like midwifery. The philosopher in this account does not deposit knowledge into the interlocutor. He does not fill an empty vessel. He does not instruct the way a craftsman instructs an apprentice, passing on a technique by demonstration. What the philosopher does is help another person give birth to what is already inside them. The knowledge or the potential for it, or the honest recognition of its absence, is already latent in the interlocutor. The questioning does not create something new. It assists in bringing something to the surface that was always there, waiting for exactly this kind of patient, careful pressure. This is a stranger claim than it first sounds. It suggests that the interlocutor is not a passive receiver of information, but an active participant in a process of discovery that only becomes possible when the initial, comfortable, unexamined certainties are loosened. It suggests that the aporia, the state of not knowing that the conversation produces, is not the obstacle to understanding, but the precondition for it. The person who does not know, they do not know, cannot begin to know. The person who arrives at a genuine recognition of the limits of what they understand has taken the first real step. Socrates had reached this understanding of his own practice by a particular road, and the road is worth following for a moment. There was, in his earlier middle age, a report that reached him from Delphi. The oracle at Delphi was the kind of institution that held real authority in the ancient world, not as a source of direct instruction, but as a source of gnomic pronouncements that required interpretation and that people took seriously enough to travel considerable distances to receive. The report was delivered by a friend of Socrates named Chavorphian, who had gone to Delphi and had posed a question about whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and had received an answer that no one was. Socrates, by the account that survives, did not receive this with the satisfaction of a man who has been publicly confirmed in a high opinion of himself. He received it with what could only be described as a troubled puzzlement. He held it like a problem he had not asked for. He knew, with the specific clarity of a person who has looked carefully at the contents of his own understanding, that he did not possess the kind of wisdom that would justify the oracle's claim. He was not, as far as he could determine, the wisest man in Athens in any conventional sense. He did not know how to build a ship. He did not know the established wisdom of the poets, whose verses were treated by educated Athenians as repositories of moral and practical truth. He did not possess the expertise of the generals and the statesmen, so he went to find the people who were reputed to be wise, and he talked to them, not with the intention of proving them ignorant, with the genuine hope of finding the wisdom that the oracle's claim would require him to have. If the claim made any sense, which he was far from certain it did. The conversations that followed were in some ways the origin of everything. The politicians he talked to were confident. They spoke with the assurance of men who had made many decisions in the presence of many people and had been accepted as authoritative. They had knowledge. They had experience. They had the particular kind of certainty that comes from having been treated as a source of wisdom for long enough that the treatment becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. And what Socrates found, when he examined them carefully, was that the certainty was broader than the knowledge that supported it. They could not, under careful questioning, give an account of what they actually knew or how they knew it. They held positions they could defend in the arena of public rhetoric, and could not defend in the different, quieter arena of the kind of questioning Socrates practiced. The poets were more interesting, and in some ways more troubling. The verses they produced were genuinely fine. Some of them were wise in ways that were difficult to trace to any specific act of reasoning. They captured something true about human experience in ways that were valuable and lasting. And yet, when he asked the poets to explain what the wise things in their poems meant, to give an account of the understanding that their verses expressed, they could not. They could produce more verses. They could elaborate and extend and add to the beauty of what they had made, but they could not explain. The wisdom in their work had not been produced by the kind of understanding that could be examined and accounted for. It had arrived by another route, one that was not available for inspection. The craftsmen, as it turned out, did know their things. The cobbler who had spent 30 years making shoes had a real and verifiable knowledge of leather and form and the particular requirements of the human foot. The builder understood stone and weight and the behavior of materials under stress. This knowledge was genuine, and Socrates found in it something that the politicians lacked, a connection between claim and evidence that could be tested against reality. The shoe either fit or it did not. The wall either stood or it did not. The difficulty was a different one. The craftsmen, having established real expertise in their specific domains, had made an additional move that the expertise did not license. They had assumed, on the basis of knowing one thing well, that they understood other things they had never examined with the same care. The cobbler who understood leather had views about justice and governance and the nature of a good life, and these views were offered with the same certainty as the views about leather, but they had no similar basis. The knowledge of the specific skill had been quietly extended into a general claim to wisdom that the specific skill could not carry. Socrates came to a conclusion. He did not possess wisdom in the conventional sense. He did not know the trade of the craftsman, the verse of the poet, the political judgment of the statesman. What he possessed, and this was the conclusion he arrived at after many of these conversations, in which he held carefully and without pleasure, was a particular kind of awareness of the boundaries of his own understanding. He knew that he did not know, and the people he had talked to, who were widely considered wiser than he was, did not, in most cases, know that they did not know. They had mistaken the confidence produced by familiarity for the solidity produced by genuine understanding. He, at least, had not made that mistake. This was not a triumphant conclusion. It was not the kind of wisdom that fills a life with the satisfaction of accumulated knowledge. It was a narrower, colder, more unsettling thing, the recognition that the terrain of genuine understanding was much smaller than the terrain of apparent understanding, and that the gap between them was where philosophy had to live. He kept going. Every morning, barefoot in the agora, he kept going. There was another dimension to his practice that is worth naming, because it is easy to overlook it in accounts that focus only on the method. Socrates did not accept payment for what he did. This was not, in the Athens of his time, a trivial choice. The sophists, who also worked in the spaces of intellectual life, charged substantial fees for their instruction. The wealthy families of Athens paid those fees readily, because what the sophists sold was genuinely valuable in terms of what the market for it rewarded: the ability to argue persuasively, to present a position with rhetorical force, to navigate the competitive spaces of assembly and law court with enough skill to prevail. These were not useless abilities. In a democratic city that settled its most important questions by argument in public, the person who could make an argument sound good had a real advantage. Socrates would not sell this. He would not sell anything. He continued to be poor in a city where the accumulation of wealth was treated as one of the more visible signs of a well-ordered life, and he continued his conversations with anyone willing to have them without asking for anything in return. The reason he gave for this, when he gave it, was not primarily about personal integrity in the way that phrase tends to be understood. It was a philosophical point. The moment a teacher accepts payment from a student, the relationship shifts. The teacher becomes answerable not to truth, but to the student's satisfaction. The student who is paying for an outcome has, through the act of payment, inserted a condition into the inquiry, not a formal condition, not one that either party would necessarily name, but a real one. The philosopher who needs the fee cannot fully follow the argument wherever it leads, because the argument might lead somewhere the paying student will not want to follow. The question of truth and the question of what the student is willing to hear have been made subtly identical, and this is a confusion that corrupts the inquiry at its origin. To keep the inquiry honest, Socrates kept it free, not free as a commercial strategy, not free as an advertisement for something else, but free in the specific sense that nothing was changing hands, no one was owed anything, and the conversation could end wherever the argument actually led, regardless of whether that place was comfortable or welcome. This created an unusual situation. A man who gave his time freely to anyone who would talk with him, who could be found most mornings in the same public space, who asked questions rather than issuing pronouncements, who left his interlocutors feeling less certain than when they had arrived, who accumulated no fee and owned nothing of particular value, who was neither a politician, nor a priest, nor a craftsman in any recognizable sense. The city did not quite know what to make of him. Some of the people he talked to came back. They came back not because the conversations had resolved anything, but because the aporia, the state of honest not knowing, had a quality that was difficult to leave entirely. It was not pleasant exactly, but it was real in a way that the confident opinions it had replaced were not. The uncomfortable recognition that a thing one had taken for granted was more complicated than it appeared had a strange value that was different from the value of the comfortable assumption. The person who now knew that they did not fully understand courage was, in a specific and hard-won sense, more accurately positioned with respect to the question of courage than the person who had never considered whether their confident belief about it was well-founded. Others did not come back. They left the conversation with the specific irritation of a person who has been made to look uncertain in front of others and who has not yet found a way to process that experience as anything other than a minor humiliation. The generals and the politicians and the prominent men who were treated as repositories of civic wisdom were not, in many cases, accustomed to the particular quality of difficulty that Socrates produced. They could handle argument, they could handle opposition. What they found harder to handle was the specific kind of exposure that came not from being contradicted, but from being walked very carefully and without any apparent hostile intention to a place where their own certainty revealed its own foundations. Some of them decided he was dangerous. Not immediately, over time, but that is a story for another part of the evening. The life of the method is what holds us here, in the morning, in the agora, before the day has become anything in particular. It is worth staying with the quality of attention Socrates brought to these exchanges, because it is unusual enough to require some care to describe. He was not performing humility. The not knowing he practiced was not a rhetorical pose, a Socratic irony designed to lull the interlocutor into lowering their guard before the dialectical attack. Scholars have debated this for a long time, and the debate has not resolved cleanly, but there is evidence on both sides, and the most patient reading of the dialogues suggests something more interesting than pure strategy. He seems to have meant it. He seems to have genuinely believed that the questions he was asking were questions he did not know the answers to. Not in every case there are dialogues in which a Socratic position becomes visible enough that calling it pure inquiry would be misleading, but in the foundational posture, in the basic orientation toward the questions, the evidence is that the not knowing was real. He did not know what justice was. He had thought about it long and carefully, and had arrived at the position that whatever it was harder to define with precision than most people assumed, and that the difficulty was important. The difficulty was important because the question was important. A city that had declared itself committed to a certain kind of justice, to the equal standing of its citizens before the law, to the collective governance of public life, and that had built elaborate institutions for enacting. That commitment was a city in which the question of what justice actually was carried real consequences. The answer was not abstract. It shaped who could speak in the assembly and who could not. It shaped what a man could own and what could be taken from him. It shaped the difference between the life of a citizen and the life of a slave. To leave that question unexamined, to accept the first comfortable definition that presented itself, and build a life on top of it without ever testing whether the foundation held, this was, to Socrates, a kind of failure that was specifically human in its reach. Animals did not have the capacity to examine the assumptions on which their lives rested. Humans did. To have that capacity and not use it was to live below what living as a human being made possible. So he kept asking. The morning light moved across the stones. The sellers of figs and dried fish concluded their first transactions of the day. The argument about the weight reached one of its periodic resting places. Someone emerged from the direction of the assembly, looking confident in the decisions that had just been made. Socrates noticed him and paused and allowed a natural conversation to begin, the way water allows a valley to form. The question, after all these years, was still the question. What is this thing we call justice? If we examine it carefully, not what does it look like from the outside, not how do we perform it in public, not what reputation does it earn its practitioners. What is it in itself, if we follow it all the way down to what it is made of? The conversation would not resolve by noon. The interlocutor would leave, eventually, in a state of greater uncertainty than when he arrived. Socrates would stand for a while in the particular quality of light that comes in mid-morning when the sun is high enough to bleach the dust and the shadows are short and precise. He would think about the question for a while in the silence that follows a long conversation, and then he would watch as another person crossed the square with the particular look of someone who knows something important and has not yet been given reason to doubt that they know it. There was always someone. There was always a question. There were always the stones of the agora, warm underfoot, holding their accumulated weight. The practice was old now, in the way that things which have found their right form become old without aging in any way that matters. He had been doing this long enough that the city had become accustomed to his presence in the way it was accustomed to the presence of the fountains and the old fig trees at the edge of the market, familiar, stable, part of the character of the place, even to those who never stopped to look at them closely. Young men came sometimes and watched the conversations. Some of them came back. Some of them began to ask questions of their own in other corners of the agora with other interlocutors, pressing in the same patient way on the same questions about justice and piety and the right conduct of a life. He did not instruct them in this. He did not run a school, did not charge a fee, did not establish a curriculum or provide a syllabus or set examinations. Whatever was transmitted by proximity and by the quality of the conversations themselves. The method, if it spread the way a practice spreads when someone watches it done well enough that they understand, not through explanation, but through exposure, what it is actually for. And what it was for, the patient, unglamorous, daily practice of pressing on the concepts people had accepted without examination, was a strange kind of care, not care for reputation, not care for the kind of success the city measured and rewarded. Care for the soul, in the specific sense that the examined life was, to Socrates, a different kind of life from the unexamined one, and the difference was the difference between a building with tested foundations and a building whose foundations had never been assessed. Most people in Athens were not engaged in this kind of examination. Most people in any city are not. The maintenance of daily life requires a working set of assumptions, and stopping to test every assumption would make the maintenance impossible. Socrates did not claim otherwise. He was not arguing for paralysis. He was arguing for a specific kind of attention to the concepts that actually governed how lives were lived and how cities were ordered, the concepts of justice and courage and piety and virtue, on the grounds that these were the concepts that, if wrong, produced the deepest kinds of harm. The general who misunderstood courage in a way he had never examined might make decisions that cost many lives before the misunderstanding was discovered. The citizen who misunderstood justice in a way he had never tested might participate in many verdicts and many laws before the misunderstanding was corrected. The politician who could not give an account of virtue was, for Socrates, in a more dangerous position than the cobbler who could not give an account of the soul, because the cobbler's ignorance would at worst produce a badly fitting shoe, while the politician's ignorance would shape the conditions under which other people's lives were lived. This was not a small claim. It had the quality of a vocation, which is perhaps why it continued for so many decades without producing the conventional kinds of reward that might have sustained a lesser commitment. The fees that were never collected, the accumulated possessions that never accumulated, the household that remained what it had always been, modest, unhurried, a place that seemed indifferent to the question of its own comfort. He came home at the end of each day, in which the agora had produced its usual abundance of questions and its usual shortage of resolved answers. He returned to a space where nothing had been added since the last return. The poverty was simply the weather of his life, as natural and unremarkable as the specific quality of light in the late afternoon, the way the shadows of the stoas fell across the square when the sun had moved far enough west. The conversations accumulated over the years, not as a treasury of conclusions, but as a body of practice. He had spent decades in the marketplace of Athens, asking questions that the marketplace could not answer with the currency it normally used. He had found the limits of what the generals knew about courage, and had not yet found courage itself. He had found the edges of what the poets knew about virtue, and had not yet found virtue itself. He had pressed on justice from many angles, and had arrived repeatedly at the recognition that justice was not what any of the first answers had said it was. None of this was failure. That is the thing about this kind of work that looks most like failure from the outside, and is, from the inside, the only kind of faithfulness available. The question had not been answered. The question had been kept alive, kept honest, kept in its full difficulty, rather than resolved into a definition that was comfortable and portable and wrong, to stay inside the question rather than escape it with a convenient reply. This was not the failure to reach a destination. It was the recognition that the destination, if there was one, required staying inside the difficulty long enough to understand what the difficulty was actually made of. The agora held its warmth long after the merchants had gathered their boards, and the crowds had thinned, and the evening began to assert itself against the long light of the Athenian afternoon. The stones that had carried 1,000 conversations carried their warmth into the cooling air, with the patient indifference of things that have absorbed more than any single day's worth of heat. A man had stood here for many years, asking questions. He had accumulated nothing that could be weighed or measured or exchanged. He had come home again and again to a household that held only what it needed, and not one thing more. He had gone back the next morning, barefoot, steady, curious in the particular way that genuine curiosity is steady rather than urgent, arrived rather than searching, and the questions were still the questions, not because they had resisted every answer, but because every answer, when examined with sufficient care, revealed the question to be deeper than the answer had assumed. There was something in this that was not frustrating, once one had lived with it long enough. Something that a patient examination of one's own certainties had a way of producing, slowly, over many years of honest inquiry. Not the satisfaction of knowing, something quieter and more durable than that. The particular rest that comes to a person who has stopped pretending to know what they do not know, and who has found, in the honest acknowledgement of not knowing, a kind of ground more solid than the confident definitions that had been examined and found wanting. The sun moved west. The shadows in the agora lengthened. The question remained, open and unhurried, in the air above the warm stones, held there by no particular urgency, requiring nothing from the evening that the evening would not in its own time provide. The house of Cephalus stood near the port of Piraeus, a short walk from the water, and on the evening the conversation began, the lamps had just been lit. Cephalus himself was an old man, white-haired and easy in his manner, the kind of man whose age had not made him bitter, but had instead given him a particular quality of settled attention, as though he had long since decided which things were worth weighing and which could be let go. He had been speaking, before his guests arrived, about the pleasures of old age, about how the body's quieting was not only loss, but something close to relief, the way a long journey feels when the road finally levels and the destination comes into view. His son Polemarchus was there. Socrates was there. Several younger men had gathered, drawn by the quality of argument the evening promised, and had arranged themselves around the old man in a loose half-circle, the lamplight distributing itself unevenly across their faces. Cephalus excused himself early. He had offerings to make, prayers to attend to, the ritual obligations of a long life lived with appropriate care. He rose and left, and with his departure something in the room shifted, not unpleasantly, but noticeably, as though the conversation had been waiting for exactly this moment to find its real subject. Polemarchus had said something about justice being a matter of giving to each what they are owed, and Socrates had asked gently what that meant exactly, and the question had settled over the gathering, the way questions settle when they are finally asked aloud, with the particular weight of something that has been in the room all along, unnamed and patient. That question, what justice is, not as a matter of custom or convenience, but as a thing that might have its own nature, independent of what any city had decided to call by that name, would carry the conversation through the entire night, growing larger as it was handled, refusing to reduce. The city was full of answers to it. The poets had answers, the lawmakers had answers, the elders had answers drawn from long experience. What made this room different was not the novelty of the question, but the willingness to hold it open past the point where most conversations turned away toward the comfort of familiar agreement. Socrates had been thinking about the soul, not the soul in the sense of some ghostly passenger carried inside the body, but the soul as the organizing principle of a human life, the part that reasons, the part that feels indignation and courage and shame, the part that hungers and thirsts and wants. He had noticed, watching people and watching himself, that these three were not always in agreement. A person could reason clearly that they should put down a cup and find themselves lifting it again. A person could know that something was beneath their dignity and feel the hot urgency of anger override that knowledge. The wanting and the knowing and the responding were not one thing. They were several things, sometimes at peace and sometimes in contest, and the shape of a life depended in large part on which of them prevailed. This observation, that the soul is not simple, but composed of genuinely distinct parts, became the foundation of everything that followed. Plato would later call these parts the logistikon, the themeides, and the epithemedikon. The names matter less than the experience they are pointing at. The rational part is the part that can step back, consider the whole, weigh consequences, trace the shape of the good. The spirited part is the source of energy and loyalty and righteous anger, the part that burns when something sacred is violated and drives a person to act in accordance with what they believe to be true. The appetitive part is vast and various and ancient, the source of hunger and thirst and desire, and the simple pull of pleasure, neither good nor bad in itself, but requiring direction, requiring governance, as a river requires banks in order to move with purpose rather than simply spreading out and going still. The argument for 3 parts rather than 2 or 1 came from a simple observation about conflict. If a person were merely rational, there would be no inner resistance to reason's conclusions. If a person were merely appetitive, there would be no capacity to resist desire. But what is actually observed in any honest account of experience is that these forces conflict, that there is something in a person that wants and something else that resists the wanting, and something else again that drives the conflict into action, for good or ill. The conflict requires distinct parties. The parties are the structure of the soul. In the lamplight at the house of Cephalus, Socrates was already working toward this picture, though it would take the whole of the long republic to make it clear. He asked about virtue. He asked about what it would mean to have a soul that was functioning as a soul should, not merely successful, not merely admired, but genuinely ordered, genuinely well. The answers that came back were partial, and he received them with patience, pressing gently at each one until it gave way and showed the difficulty it had been concealing. He was not trying to win, he was trying to see. The image that finally emerged was this: justice in the individual soul is a condition of harmony, not harmony in the sense of everything feeling pleasant and undisturbed, but harmony in the older and more serious sense, the relationship between parts that is right, the arrangement in which each thing performs its proper function without overstepping into the function of another. Reason governs. The spirited part supports reason's governance with energy and loyalty, acting as its instrument and ally when the appetite threatens to overwhelm the whole. The appetitive part, vast as it is, operates within the boundaries reason has established, neither suppressed into bitterness nor permitted to expand until it crowds out everything else. This is what justice feels like, the argument suggests, when it is genuinely present inside a person. Not a rule followed under compulsion, not a reputation maintained for the benefit of witnesses. Something structural, internal, a way of being organized that makes a person capable of functioning as a human being fully should. The just person is not merely well behaved, the just person is whole. It is worth pausing on what this means for the opposite condition. Injustice, on this account, is not merely bad conduct, it is a kind of illness, the soul in which appetite rules reason, in which the spirited part has been recruited into the service of desire rather than wisdom, in which the reasoning capacity is used not to govern, but to rationalize and enable. Such a soul is sick in the way a body is sick, when its constituent functions have broken down. The person who is apparently powerful, apparently successful, apparently getting everything they want at anyone else's expense, this person, on Plato's account, is in the worst possible condition, not despite their power, but because of how they acquired it, and what the acquiring has done to the inside of them. This is an unusual claim, and it requires sitting with it rather than moving past it too quickly. The conventional view, the view the sophists held, The view the Athenian envoys embodied when they sailed to Melos was that power is its own reward, that the strong man who can take what he wants without consequence is flourishing in the most complete sense available. Plato's Republic is, among other things, a sustained argument against this view. Its counterclaim is that the soul has a nature, the way a body has a nature, and that when the soul's nature is disordered, the person suffers a genuine harm, regardless of how their external circumstances look to others. The argument for this runs through an analogy between soul and body that recurs throughout the Republic. A body that cannot perform its natural functions is not a healthy body, regardless of how it appears on the outside. The person who moves through the world in apparent ease, while a disease works quietly through their interior, is not flourishing. They are diminished. Applied to the soul, the person who moves through the world accumulating power and pleasure, while their capacity for reason is subordinated to appetite, while the spirited part has become merely the enforcer of desire, rather than the ally of wisdom. This person is not flourishing either. They are the same kind of sick, only in a different part of what they are. What Plato does next in the Republic is remarkable for its patience. Rather than accepting the argument as demonstrated and moving on, he builds a second structure alongside the first. A Citian argument, constructed word by word over the course of many hours, and uses the larger scale of the city to make visible what is difficult to see at the scale of the individual soul. The city can be examined the way a body might be examined by a careful physician, its parts identified, their functions described, the places where disorder has entered marked and named. And the city, once examined, reflects the soul back in a form large enough to read. The city in the Republic is built from necessity. It begins with the simplest human need: food, shelter, the basic requirements that no person can meet entirely alone, and builds outward from there, function by function, until it has acquired the full complexity of a developed society. And as it builds, three distinct groups emerge, corresponding with striking precision to the three parts of the soul. There are the producers, the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants, those whose primary relationship to the world is appetitive in the broad sense, who provide for material needs, whose excellence consists in skill and industry and the reliable provision of what others require. There are the auxiliaries, the soldiers and enforcers, spirited and loyal, whose excellence consists in courage and discipline and the willingness to act in defense of the city's values when called. And there are the philosopher rulers, those in whom reason has developed most fully, who have made the long ascent toward genuine knowledge of what justice and goodness are, and who therefore govern not from personal ambition or appetite, but from the actual understanding of what a city requires in order to be well. Justice in the city, on this account, is the same structural thing as justice in the soul. Each class performs its proper function. Each class confines itself to that function rather than annexing the functions of the others. The producers do not attempt to rule. The auxiliaries do not attempt to govern policy. The rulers do not accumulate private wealth. When each part does what it is best fitted to do, and nothing more, the city as a whole coheres, and that cohesion is what justice is at the civic scale. The argument for philosopher rulers is the part of this vision that has always attracted the most resistance, and the resistance is worth taking seriously. The argument rests on a distinction between two kinds of cognition: genuine knowledge and mere opinion. Most people, most of the time, operate at the level of opinion. They have beliefs about what is good, what is just, what a city should do, but these beliefs are formed by habit and custom and the influence of those around them, and they shift when the influences shift. They are responsive to persuasion, to fear, to fashion. A democratic assembly composed of citizens operating at this level will make decisions that feel right in the moment and may be entirely wrong by any more durable measure. The way a crowd pressing toward the edge of a cliff can feel a collective momentum that no individual member has chosen. The philosopher, through a long and arduous process of education, dialectical assent, the patient working through of increasingly fundamental questions, reaches something different, not opinion, but genuine knowledge, an understanding of what justice actually is, what the good actually is, grounded not in shifting human convention, but in the nature of things as they are. This knowledge is represented in the Republic by the form of the good, the ultimate source and ground of all intelligibility and value. The philosopher who has seen this, who has ascended to where its light reaches, does not govern from preference or ambition. The philosopher governs because they understand, in the way a navigator understands currents and stars and weather, while the passengers debate the route by majority vote, and because understanding of this kind carries an obligation that cannot be refused merely because the return to the cave is difficult. Plato himself offers the image of the ship, and it is a patient image, slow and exact, a vessel at sea. The passengers are many and various, each with opinions about where the ship should go and what the weather portends, and which port would suit them best. The navigator is one, and the navigator's knowledge is not a matter of popular consensus, but of long training and attentive study of the actual conditions the ship moves through. What would it mean to navigate by committee? Not merely inefficient, but dangerous, not because the passengers are bad people, but because navigating a ship requires a kind of knowledge that voting cannot produce. Plato's argument about governance has the same structure. The city that is steered by untrained popular preference will not reach the good, not because the citizens are wicked, but because wisdom is not the same as the aggregation of preferences, and the aggregation of preferences, however earnestly undertaken, does not produce wisdom. This is not a comfortable argument in any age that prizes democratic self-determination, and it was not comfortable in Athens either. But the force of it depends on a premise that is worth feeling fully before accepting or refusing. The premise that there is something justice actually is, independent of what any particular person, or city, or historical moment has decided to call by that name. If that premise holds, if justice has a nature that can be known rather than merely agreed upon, then the argument for philosopher rulers follows with a certain slow inevitability. And if the premise does not hold, if justice is ultimately whatever the strong impose and the weak accept, then the Athenian envoys at Melos were not wrong at all, only honest. Between those two positions, the whole of the Republic sits, patient and enormous, building its case brick by careful brick. There is a passage toward the end of the Republic in which Plato describes the soul of the tyrant, and it is one of the most careful pieces of psychological portraiture in the ancient world. The tyrant is not presented as a monster, not as someone visibly deformed or obviously malicious. The tyrant is presented as someone in whom the appetitive part of the soul has been permitted, over years, and by a sequence of choices, each one of which seemed reasonable at the time, to grow until it crowds out everything else. The tyrannical soul is the soul in which one desire, the master desire, the desire that organizes all other desires in its service, has taken the governing position that reason is meant to hold. What follows from this is not triumph, but imprisonment. The tyrant, surrounded by wealth and power, is incapable of trust, because the only relationships available to someone governed by appetite are relationships of use, and the tyrant knows, at some level, that everyone around them knows this and is waiting for an opportunity. The tyrant cannot sleep well because the appetites that have been fed do not quiet with feeding, but grow louder. The tyrant cannot rest in any accomplishment because the master desire, once satisfied, generates a new version of itself that demands satisfaction in turn. What looks from the outside like the maximum condition of power is from the inside the minimum condition of freedom. Plato sets this portrait next to the portrait of the philosopher in quiet harmony, not triumphant either, not adorned with power or wealth or public celebration, but inhabiting the interior of a well-ordered life with something that can only be called peace. The reasoning capacity governing, the spirited part at ease in its proper role, the appetitive part neither suppressed into resentment nor expanded into tyranny, but present and acknowledged and appropriately directed. This person is free in a sense the tyrant is not. Free not from external constraint, but from the internal servitude that comes when desire has taken the wheel of a life and turned it toward nothing the soul can finally rest in. Plato does not claim this freedom is easy to achieve or common. The argument of the Republic is not that most people are just, or that most cities are well ordered, or that the philosopher king is a likely feature of any actual city anyone is going to live in. The argument is about what justice is, about the nature of the thing that these words are pointing at, and the image of the well-ordered soul is the clearest picture the argument produces. Whether any particular person or city approximates that image is a separate question, answered by looking honestly at the specific arrangement of its parts and asking whether each one is performing its proper function or reaching into the space reserved for another. The house of Cephalus, in the long evening, held this conversation in the way that certain kinds of architecture hold light, not containing it so much as giving it a space in which to distribute itself. Polemarchus had moved past his initial definition. Socrates had questioned and been questioned in turn, and the younger men around the edge of the room had grown quieter as the evening deepened, which was a sign not of boredom, but of the particular stillness that arrives when a conversation has reached the level at which it is no longer possible to follow it casually. Something was being built, argument by argument, the way a craftsman builds, not in a single gesture, but in the patient accumulation of steps, each one of which must be right before the next can stand on it. The craftsman analogy runs through the Republic in a quiet way that is easy to miss. Plato returns again and again to the image of the artisan who understands the nature of their material and works in accordance with that nature rather than against it. The cobbler who knows leather, who understands its properties and its limits and its possibilities, produces shoes that are genuinely good, not merely shoes that look fine from a distance, but shoes that perform the function. Shoes exist to perform. Applied to the soul, the person who knows the soul's nature, who understands what it requires in order to function as a human soul, can work on that nature in a way that brings it closer to its proper condition. Education in the Republic is this kind of work, not the filling of an empty vessel, but the patient reorientation of a capacity that already exists toward the good it was always fitted for. The philosopher's work is therefore not separate from the craftsman's work in kind, only in subject. The craftsman works on leather or bronze or wood. The philosopher works on the soul structure, their own soul, and through argument, the souls of those around them. The city in the Republic is built by this kind of work, assembled in conversation, each part positioned through the slow application of reason to the question of what function that part should serve. The city is, in this sense, The argument made visible a structure of thought that enacts in its own organization the harmony it is trying to describe. It is worth sitting with the image of that city for a moment, not as a political program to be enacted, but as a philosophical object to be contemplated. The producers going about their work with skill and thoroughness, the auxiliaries at their stations, courageous and disciplined, neither cruel nor timid, ready when needed. The philosopher rulers in deliberation, their long education behind them, their personal desires, subordinated to the requirements of what they know, governing not from above, not from contempt for those they govern, but from a knowledge that carries its own weight and its own obligation, each part in its place, each function performed by those most fitted for it, the whole coherent, each element dependent on and supporting every other. This image is not a utopia in the sense of a fantasy of perfection. It is a measuring instrument. Plato's ideal city exists in the argument, not in order to be built, but in order to give the philosopher a standard against which actual cities can be assessed and found wanting and examined for where the deviation from harmony has entered and what it has cost. Every real city departs from the image in various ways. Every real soul departs from the image. The question the image poses is not whether this departure can be avoided, but what it consists in and what might be done about it within the conditions of the actual world. The evening at the house of Cephalus was ordinary in every external respect. There was wine, there was conversation, there was the sound of the port somewhere in the distance, faint and continuous. Polemarchus was a hospitable young man, proud of his father's house, and glad to fill it with good argument. Socrates was barefoot, as he generally was, and he sat with the comfortable attentiveness of someone for whom thinking was not an effort, but a natural medium. The way of fish is not making an effort when it moves through water. But the conversation they were having was extraordinary in the only sense that matters. It was honest. It refused the easy answer. It pressed past the conventional response, past the inherited definition, past the satisfying formulation that everyone in Athens could agree to without anyone needing to examine what they were agreeing to. It asked what justice actually was, and it kept asking, and when each answer broke down under examination, it did not despair, but leaned toward the difficulty with something that can only be called interest. What emerged from that leaning? The image of the soul in its proper order, the three parts in their proper relationship, reason governing, and the spirited element, loyal, and the appetitive resting within its appropriate boundaries, was not a final answer. Plato would not have called it a final answer, and Socrates would not have claimed it as one. It was a picture of what a well-ordered interior looks like when you try to describe it clearly rather than gesture at it from a comfortable distance. And the picture had a quality that pictures of genuinely important things tend to have, which is that the more carefully it is examined, the more it seems to be describing something real, not merely an argument about how souls work, but an account of a condition that most people have some acquaintance with, the times when reason and energy and desire have moved in the same direction, when what was wanted and what was wise and what felt right were briefly the same thing, when a decision was made, not from confusion or compulsion, but from genuine clarity about what the situation required. Those moments are not common, but they are recognizable, and their recognizability is part of what the Republic is relying on. The soul knows what harmony feels like, even if it cannot always sustain it. And the Republic's argument is that this recognition, the capacity to feel the difference between the ordered and the disordered interior, is not merely a subjective preference, but a perception of something real, something that has its own nature and can be described and aimed at, and, with appropriate work and appropriate governance, approximated. The lamplight in the house of Cephalus fell on the walls and on the faces of the people gathered there, and the conversation moved in the way good conversations move, not in a straight line but in a spiral, returning to the same questions from different angles, each return finding them a little differently shaped, the way an object looks different in changing light without having changed itself. The question of what justice was had not been answered by the time the evening deepened fully into night. It would not be answered for a long time yet, but it had been made more visible, and that is what patient argument does, not resolve the question, but sharpen the shape of it until its actual difficulty becomes clear, until what needs to be examined can be seen plainly, until the philosophers gathered around it can face what they are actually facing and proceed from there. The well-ordered soul rests in its own harmony, the way a room rests in proportion, not because nothing moves within it, but because the movements are related, each one occupying its proper space, none overwhelming the others, the whole able to hold its shape through the ordinary pressures of a life. Reason at the high point, clear and patient, the spirited element below it, ready and willing and properly directed, the appetitive part, present as it must always be present, acknowledged and provided for, and not permitted to claim more than its share of the interior. This is the condition the Republic is pointing at when it uses the word justice. Not a rule obeyed, not a reputation maintained. A form of internal peace that requires nothing external to sustain it. A peace that is the natural condition of a soul that has found its proper arrangement and can rest at last in its own order. Thrasymachus had been waiting for a long time. The conversation had been moving quietly for several exchanges, voices measured and careful, and he had been sitting with his argument coiled inside him, growing heavier with each polite exchange, until the patience he had been performing simply gave way. He rose, or leaned forward, or pushed himself into the space between the other speakers, the exact gesture lost, but the energy of it preserved in the record, and the room changed. What had been a philosophical conversation became, for a moment, a confrontation, and the argument he placed on the table was not subtle. It was blunt and cold, and carried the weight of a man who believed, with complete conviction, that everyone else in the room was either deceiving themselves or performing an innocence they did not actually possess. Justice, Thrasymachus said, is the advantage of the stronger. The words sit in the record the way certain things sit, after they have been said aloud for the first time. Not shocking, exactly, but clarifying, as though something that had been circulating in the air of Athens for a generation had finally been named by someone willing to own it. Justice is whatever those who hold power decide it will be. Laws are made by rulers to serve the interests of rulers. What is called justice by the powerful is obedience imposed on the powerless, dressed in the language of obligation. And anyone who follows these rules in the belief that they serve something real, something beyond the arrangement of power, is not virtuous. They are simply naive. Socrates received this, not with alarm, but with something that looked, in the account, almost like genuine interest. He asked questions. He moved carefully, the way one moves in a room where something breakable is nearby. He was not performing composure. He was actually composed because the argument Thrasymachus had offered was not to Socrates monstrous. It was a philosophical position, seriously held, and it deserved a philosophical answer. The composure was the method. The equanimity was not indifference to the stakes. It was the only condition under which the stakes could be handled honestly. What Thrasymachus had done in a room in the Piraeus with a group of men who had settled in for a long evening was to say the thing that Athens had been enacting for years without saying. The Melian dialogue, recorded by Thucydides with the precise detachment of a physician recording a symptom, had shown the same logic in action. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Thrasymachus had simply moved that observation from the harbor to the philosophical conversation, given it a name, and dared anyone to prove it wrong. The dare was not rhetorical. He believed it, and the belief was not comfortably held at a distance. It was close and immediate, and had the quality of something a person has tested against experience and found to hold. Socrates pressed him on it, point by point, the way the Olympians always moved, not attacking, but asking, if justice is the advantage of the stronger, what happens when the stronger party makes a mistake about its own interests and legislates in a way that actually harms it? Is that mistaken law still justice, or does it cease to be justice the moment the ruler's judgment proves wrong? Thrasymachus adjusted. He argued that the ruler, properly understood, does not make such mistakes, that a ruler, insofar as they are a ruler, rules with the knowledge proper to ruling. And Socrates followed that adjustment with another question, because the conversation was not about winning, it was about finding out whether the position, held honestly and examined carefully, could support the weight it claimed to carry. By the time Thrasymachus finished, the original bluntness of his argument had softened into something more qualified, and he was not, the account suggests, entirely satisfied with what remained. He handed the conversation to others and sat back. The argument was not defeated, it was examined, and the examination had shown something important, that the position required more work than its initial confidence suggested. The room settled. Glaucon watched all of this, and when the space opened, he stepped into it, not with Thrasymachus's impatience, but with something more measured, and in a way, more unsettling. He said that the arguments for justice had not been adequately answered, not because Thrasymachus was right necessarily, but because the case for justice had not yet been made on the only terms that mattered. He wanted to hear justice defended for what it actually was, not for what it produced, not for the reputation it earned, not for the divine reward it might bring, but for what it was in itself, stripped of every advantage that attending it from the outside. Before he made his argument, he organized the landscape. There are three kinds of goods, Glaucon said. There are things we choose purely for their own sake, pleasure, the simple enjoyment of a good thing, where no further purpose is needed to justify the wanting. There are things we choose both for themselves and for what they bring, health, for instance, which is pleasant in itself and also makes other things possible. And there are things we endure only because of their consequences, the painful treatments, the difficult labors, the things no one would want for their own sake, but that lead somewhere worth going. He put the question plainly to Socrates, which of these is justice? And the answer he said he wanted to hear was that justice belongs to the second category, chosen for its own sake and for its consequences both, the best kind of good there is. But first, he said, he would make the case for the opposite position as forcefully as he could, not because he believed it, he was careful to say, he wanted to hear it, argued well, so that the answer to it would have to be genuinely adequate. The distinction mattered. Glaucon was not Thrasymachus. He was not standing behind the argument he was about to make. He was holding it at arm's length and saying, this is the most powerful version of the challenge. Now answer it. The story he told involved a ring. A shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia found a hollow in the earth after an earthquake, and inside the hollow was a bronze horse with a golden ring inside it. The shepherd took the ring. When he sat with his companions afterward, he turned the ring on his finger and realized that when the setting faced inward, he disappeared from sight. He tried it several times. It worked each time. He was invisible, completely and reliably, to everyone around him. What he did next was what Glaucon wanted to sit with. The shepherd arranged to be sent as a messenger to the royal court. Once inside, invisible, he seduced the queen. With her help, he killed the king. He took the throne. The movement from invisibility to desire to murder to sovereignty was in the story almost seamless. The freedom to act without consequence became immediately the freedom to want everything and to take it. Glaucon's question was not whether this particular shepherd was a bad person. His question was whether any person, would behave differently. The truly just person, he said, given this ring, would do exactly what the unjust person would do, because the only difference between them has always been the fear of being seen. Justice, on this account, is the arrangement we settle for when we lack the power to act otherwise. It is not chosen, it is suffered. And the man who keeps to it with the ring on his finger is not virtuous, he is foolish, or he has not yet fully understood what he is holding. The thought experiment has a quality that makes it difficult to dismiss by simply insisting one would behave well, because the point is not whether a particular person, imagining themselves the shepherd, believes they would keep the ring unused. The point is that the only grounds for that belief, if it holds at all, are grounds that have not yet been tested. Glaucon was asking Socrates to defend justice against the case that its practice is entirely a function of social pressure, legal consequence, and the visibility of one's actions. If all of that were removed, what would remain? He pressed further. Imagine two people, he said. The first is completely just in their inner nature, genuinely, thoroughly oriented toward the right. But everyone believes them to be unjust. Their reputation is destroyed. They suffer every social consequence that attaches to injustice without having committed any. The second person is genuinely unjust, but appears perfectly virtuous. Their reputation is spotless. They are praised, rewarded, trusted, celebrated. Their inner corruption is entirely concealed from everyone who might judge it. Given these two lives, not the comfortable middle ground, not the situation in which good conduct is also well rewarded, but these two stripped-down extremes, which person is better off? The question was not asked to suggest an easy answer. Glaucon knew the answer Socrates would give. What he wanted was the argument that could actually support it. Because the ordinary answers to this question, the just person will be rewarded eventually, or the gods will see and compensate in time, or the unjust person will eventually be found out. All these answers belong to the category of external goods. They argued that justice pays off in the end, and Glaucon had already set those answers aside. He wanted to know whether a life of genuine justice was better than a life of successful injustice in itself, at the level of what it meant to live inside each of those two lives, from the inside out. Adeimantus had been listening through all of this, and when Glaucon finished, he did not depart from the challenge, but deepened it in a different direction. What troubled him was not only the argument about the ring. What troubled him was everything that poets and parents and priests and public opinion had ever said in praise of justice, and what all that praise, when examined, actually amounted to. He listed it carefully. Parents told children to be just so that they would be loved and respected. Poets praised the rewards of virtue and described the divine punishments that awaited the wicked. The entire apparatus of moral education, as it existed in Athens and everywhere else, commended justice not for what it was, but for what it delivered: the good reputation, the blessing of the gods, the avoidance of shame, the inheritance that flows to the virtuous family. And then there was the other tradition, the one that praised cleverness. The poets also said, in places that injustice carried out with enough skill could go undetected, and what the gods could not detect, they could not punish. There were ritual cleansings available, it was said, that could remove the stain of even serious wrongdoing. The message that circulated alongside the official praise of virtue was that the thing to avoid was not injustice itself, but the consequences of being caught in it. Adeimantus said that all of this, the praise and the implied advice, and the ritual remedies, had never once argued that justice was worth having for its own sake. Not one voice in the tradition, as far as he could find, had made that case cleanly. Every argument praised the appearance of justice, or the consequences of justice, or the rewards of appearing just. The thing itself, apart from all of that, what it was, and why it would be worth wanting, even with the ring, even stripped of every reputation and consequence, this had never been properly defended. So Socrates had the full weight of the challenge before him, not the blunt provocation of Thrasymachus, which had been the raw assertion of power, but something more patient and more exact, the demand that justice be shown to be intrinsically valuable, worth choosing on its own terms, at the level of what it does to the person who possesses it. The answer Socrates began to build used an image and an analogy. The image was the city, not because justice in a city is more important than justice in a person, but because the city is larger, and what is harder to see at the scale of a single soul becomes visible when scaled up. If the structure of justice can be seen in the city, what parts it has, how they relate, what happens when the arrangement is right, and what happens when it breaks down, then perhaps the same structure can be found again in the soul, at the same proportions but smaller. The city, in argument, was built function by function, need by need. People come together because they are not self-sufficient, because no one person can produce everything that a human life requires. The city begins in necessity and grows into something more than necessity. It acquires craftsmen and farmers and merchants, and then soldiers to protect it, and then governors to direct it. Each of these groups performs a function. The well-ordered city is the one in which each group performs its proper function without encroaching on the others. The farmers do not attempt to govern. The soldiers do not attempt to farm. The governors do not attempt to fight the city's wars. Personally, justice in the city is exactly this, each part doing what it is suited to do in its proper place, with neither encroachment nor neglect. It is not a rule any single citizen follows. It is a condition the city is in, a structural arrangement that allows each function to operate at its best, because each is supported and not interfered with by the others. Then the scale changed. The same structure exists, Socrates proposed, within the person. There is a part that reasons, that considers, weighs, plans, understands. There is a part that generates energy and response, that feels the heat of indignation and the push of commitment, that can be directed by reason or can act on its own. And there is a part that wants appetite, desire, the pull toward pleasure and away from pain, the hunger that is never permanently satisfied, but only temporarily fed. These three parts of the soul are genuinely distinct, because a person can simultaneously desire something and resist that desire, and two things that are in genuine conflict cannot be the same thing. Justice in the soul is the condition in which reason governs. The spirited part carries out what reason directs, with appropriate energy and loyalty, and appetite follows rather than leads. This is not suppression. The appetitive part is not silenced or denied. It is ordered. It receives what is appropriate to it. But it does not set the direction. It does not overwhelm the other two. The governing principle is reason, and when reason governs, the whole soul functions at its best, each part doing what it is naturally suited for, receiving what genuinely satisfies it, operating without the friction of internal civil war. Injustice, on this account, is not primarily a social wrong. It is a condition of the soul. It is what happens when appetite overruns reason, when the part of us that simply wants is allowed to set the direction without reference to what is genuinely good, when the ordering principle is reversed. The tyrant in Book 9 of the Republic is the clearest image of this. He is not powerful in any sense that corresponds to genuine flourishing. He is enslaved. Every appetite he satisfies generates a new appetite. The satisfaction is temporary, and the wanting is permanent. He cannot trust anyone because his own soul is governed by forces that have no loyalty to anything outside themselves. He cannot rest because the part of him that never rests is in charge of everything. Socrates held this image steadily, not as a monster, but as a man who has everything in the external sense and nothing in the internal one, surrounded by what he has taken, unable to enjoy it, watching everyone near him for signs of the treachery he himself practices, consuming and finding that each consumption makes the next one more necessary. The wealth is real, the palace is real, the power to compel obedience is real, and the poverty is real. The poverty is interior, and it is complete. Now set beside this the person whose soul is in order, whose reason governs, who is not, on account of this, free from desire. They desire many things, and the spirited part in them responds with energy and loyalty to what reason endorses. But there is a quality of peace in the arrangement, not the peace of passivity, the peace of a thing functioning as it is designed to function, each part at ease in its proper work, the whole moving with a kind of internal coherence that requires nothing from outside to sustain it. Socrates did not claim this was an easy condition to achieve. He was not saying that the just person is calm because they feel nothing. He was saying that the arrangement of the parts, when reason leads and the others follow in their proper relation to it, produces a form of internal stability that unjust arrangements destroy. The unjust soul is at war with itself, always. The just soul is not, and a soul at war with itself, however much it acquires from outside, cannot be said to be doing well. The acquisition is not the same as the flourishing. This was the argument against Glaucon's shepherd. The ring removes the external consequences. What it does not remove is the soul. If the shepherd uses the ring to kill and take and enslave, the changes are not only in the world outside him, they are in him. The part of him that wanted the throne is the part that will govern once he has the throne. That part has learned that wanting is enough, that the path from desire to possession requires nothing like justice. It will continue to want and to take, and the king it makes of him will be governed by the same principle that made him a murderer, and the soul behind the crown will be the soul of the shepherd in the hollow, turning the ring and feeling the invisibility, except that now the invisibility has become the condition of the soul itself, unseen, ungoverned, turned inward against its own capacity for order. Glaucon had asked for justice to be defended on its own terms, without reference to reputation or divine reward. Socrates had tried to show that the defense was this, that a just soul is a soul in which each part is doing what it genuinely does best, in proper relation to the others. and that this condition is not merely pleasant, but constitutive of what it means to function well as a human being. The unjust soul is not merely unlucky, it is not merely at risk of bad consequences, it is, in a specific and serious sense, sick. It is not doing what a soul does when it is functioning as it should. And to be sick in that way, to have the governing principle disordered, to be driven by the part of oneself that has no direction beyond its own gratification, is bad regardless of whether anyone else ever finds out. The ring changes nothing. The shepherd, turning it on his finger, has not gained freedom. He has only removed the external constraints on a self that, depending on how it is ordered, will either use that freedom well or use it to destroy itself from the inside. A Dementus had asked why anyone praised justice, only for its consequences. Socrates' answer to this was embedded in the same structure, because the person who praises justice only for its consequences has not yet understood what justice is. They are praising a shadow. The substance is interior. The substance is the condition of the soul, when reason governs, the condition in which each part is neither starved nor given sole authority, the condition that Plato would describe as health, not metaphorically, but as a genuine analogy to the health of the body, which is bad for the body, not merely because of its social consequences, but because it is a failure of the body's natural capacity to function. The argument did not resolve every difficulty. It was not meant to. It was meant to show that the question Glaucon had raised, is justice worth choosing for its own sake, had an answer that did not depend on external goods, and that the answer was located in the interior of the person who either possessed justice or lacked it. The man in the cave, the ruler behind the curtain, the invisible shepherd in the hollow, all of them, whatever they acquired, were carrying their souls with them, and the soul either governed itself well or it did not. That condition was the thing that mattered. Everything else was consequence. There is a quality to the challenge. Thrasymachus brought into the room, and the challenge Glaucon and Adimantus pressed it toward, that makes it difficult to hold at a comfortable distance. Not because the arguments are overwhelming, but because they are the arguments any honest person has entertained at some point, perhaps quietly, in the private register of a mind not yet certain of what it believes. The ring is not a strange hypothetical. The ring is the thought that comes to anyone who has watched injustice succeed and justice go unrewarded, who has noticed that the visible and the real do not always coincide, who has sat with the question of whether the arrangements we call justice are simply the preferences of whoever happened to consolidate power first. Socrates had sat with these questions too. The composure with which he received Thrasymachus's argument was not the composure of someone who had never considered the possibility that Thrasymachus was right. It was the composure of someone who had considered it carefully and for a long time, and had found in the consideration something that the argument itself did not contain, the realization that the soul in which appetite overruns reason is not a soul that has achieved freedom. It is a soul that has achieved a particularly thorough form of captivity. The argument rests. It does not demand that the listener agree with every step. It does not require that the tripartite soul be accepted as a precise map of interior life. What it requires, what it has always required, is only the willingness to take seriously the possibility that justice is not merely a social arrangement, not merely the agreement of the powerful, not merely the behavior we perform when someone is watching, that there might be something it refers to inside the person, some condition of being genuinely in order, that carries its own weight regardless of the ring, regardless of the reputation, regardless of what the world outside sees or fails to see. Thrasymachus went quiet after a while and stayed quiet. The conversation moved forward without him, deeper into the architecture of the city and the soul. But his argument did not leave the room. It sat there with the others, present in the questions Glaucon and Adeimantus pressed to their conclusion, and in the care with which Socrates tried to meet them, because the argument that justice is only power dressed in the language of virtue is not defeated by being ignored. It is the argument that demands the most honest answer possible, because it is the argument that has, in one form or another, been present in every serious thinking life that has tried to understand what justice is and why, given the full weight of everything that tells against it, a person might still choose it. The room in the Piraeus was quiet by late evening, the torches lower, the argument having moved through its full range, from challenge to construction, to the first shape of an answer. The just soul in its harmony and the unjust soul in its disorder had both been laid out clearly enough to see, and what remained in the space between them was not resolution, but something more durable, the question held openly, without urgency, at the depth where questions become livable rather than threatening, where the difficulty of not knowing settles into a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when the thing that seemed intolerable has been looked at long enough that it becomes instead the landscape in which a careful life takes place. The question these challenges raised was not finally a debating point. It was a question about what it means to be alive inside a self, to carry the governing structure of one's soul through every decision and every day, in the visibility of the agora and in the hollow where no one watches. Socrates had sat inside that question for decades without resolving it into a formula, without settling for the comfortable answers that praised justice only for its fruits. He had held it at the level where it was genuinely hard, and he had found there, in that difficulty, not despair, but a kind of orientation, the direction in which the examined life continues to move, the direction of reason toward what is genuinely ordered, genuinely good, genuinely its own, at rest in the arrangement that requires nothing from outside to make it whole. Somewhere deep in the cave, before the argument has a name, before the allegory has been assigned its meaning, there is only a body that has not moved in a very long time. The limbs are stiff. The neck has held one position so long that the muscles have forgotten the range of motion they once had. The light that falls on the wall ahead is the only light there has ever been, and the shadows that cross it, large, shifting, cast by objects moving behind and above, are the only world that has ever existed. Not because the world has been hidden, because no other world has been noticed. The body simply has not turned. This is how Plato opens the deepest chamber of his argument, not with a declaration, not with a theorem, with a body that needs to turn and cannot yet, and does not know that turning is possible. In Book 7 of the Republic, the turning begins slowly. It begins with difficulty. The neck resists. The muscles, long unused, send back something close to pain. And when the body finally manages to rotate toward the source of the light, the first thing it encounters is not illumination, but something worse, a brightness that the eyes cannot tolerate, a fire behind the figures that cast the shadows, closer and more violent than the soft projected images the eyes have always known. The first glimpse of a more real world is not comfortable. It is not a gift that feels like a gift. It is a confrontation with something the eyes were not prepared to receive, and the instinct in the first moments is not to press forward, but to turn back, where the shadows are manageable, where the eyes know what they are looking at, where the darkness is at least familiar. Plato does not soften this. The philosopher who wrote the allegory had sat in enough conversations to know that the first experience of genuine philosophical questioning is not relief, it is disorientation. The person who came to the conversation certain of what justice was, or what piety was, or what courage was, does not leave the conversation feeling wiser. They leave it in aporia, a state of genuine perplexity, the certainty dissolved, and nothing solid yet in its place. This is the cave's firelight, brighter than the shadows. Still not the sun, the ascent continues, out through the cave's entrance, which is not marked with any sign, which requires no special credential to pass through, which is simply the continuation of the turning that began when the neck first rotated. Out into the world above the cave, where the sun falls on actual things, trees and water, and the faces of actual people, and the eyes, still adjusting, still learning what they are meant to do in this kind of light, begin slowly to receive what is there, not all at once. The style guide for this process, as Plato understood it, is patience. The eyes are taught by exposure. They need time. They need the repeated encounter with real things before real things begin to look real rather than overwhelming. And then, at the end of the ascent, something Plato calls the form of the good. He does not describe it directly. He knows better than to describe it directly. Instead, he reaches for an analogy, the same one he has used before and will use again, because it is the closest available approach. The sun, not as a symbol of warmth or life or divinity, though it carries all of those resonances, but as a model for a particular kind of metaphysical function. The sun, Plato observes, does two things at once. It causes things to exist in the visible world. Without solar energy, nothing grows, nothing sustains itself, nothing is generated, and it causes things to be visible. Without its light, the eye has nothing to work with, and even existing things are invisible in complete darkness. The form of the good performs both functions for the realm of the intelligible. It is the source of the being of all the other forms, and it is the source of their knowability. Without it, the other forms would not exist, and even if they somehow existed, they could not be known. Justice, on this account, is not a human agreement. It is not a social compact. It is not the arrangement that those who hold power find convenient to impose. It is a form, an objective, unchanging structure of reality that the well-trained philosophical mind can come to know, the way the eyes, once properly adjusted, can come to see actual things rather than shadows. This is the claim Plato builds the entire Republic toward, and it is a claim that once genuinely held, does not leave room for the position that justice is merely convention, merely the strong doing what they can. The philosopher who returns from that ascent carries something back into the cave, not a lecture, not a set of propositions to be repeated, something closer to a change in the quality of attention, the ability to look at the shadows on the wall and know from the inside that they are shadows, that the world is larger than the wall, that the light source is behind and above, and that the figures casting the shadows have a solidity that the shadows lack. The return to the cave is not triumphant. Plato is clear about this. The philosopher who returns will seem foolish to the people still watching the wall. Their eyes have adjusted in the wrong direction, toward brightness, toward depth, and in the relative darkness of the cave, they stumble, they misread, they fail to move quickly and confidently, the way the shadow interpreters do. The residents of the cave may find this laughable. They may find it threatening. They may, in certain historical circumstances, put the returning philosopher on trial. In the spring of the year that Athenian calendars recorded as the first year of the 95th Olympiad, a year known now as 399 BCE, a man named Socrates stood before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens and was asked to defend himself against charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. He was barefoot. He had, by this point in his life, been barefoot for so long that it was no longer a statement or an affectation. It was simply how he moved through the world. He was in his 70s. He had spent the better part of his adult life in conversation in the agora and the streets and the houses of Athens, asking questions about justice and piety and courage and virtue, and he had accumulated in all that time no wealth, no property, no political influence, and no reputation for certainty. What he had accumulated was something harder to name, a kind of philosophical residue, the slow deposit of decades spent genuinely inside the questions rather than moving efficiently past them. The apology, Plato's account of the defense Socrates gave, does not read like a legal argument. It reads like a man explaining, quietly and without particular urgency, what he has been doing and why he cannot stop. The charges were serious. The atmosphere of Athens in those years carried a particular kind of political anxiety. The city had recently emerged from decades of devastating war, had endured the violence of an oligarchic coup, had barely reconstituted its democratic order, and was in the mood that cities sometimes enter when they have been frightened for a long time and are looking for something stable to hold on to. A man who spent his days questioning the foundations of established belief was not, in that atmosphere, a harmless eccentric. He was a problem, and Socrates knew this. He stood before the jury with full knowledge of what the vote might produce, and he did not weep, and he did not beg, and he did not bring his family forward to arouse pity in the jurors, though all of these were established rhetorical practices that an Athenian jury would have recognized and partly expected. He simply spoke. He spoke about the oracle at Delphi, which had reportedly declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and about the long campaign of inquiry that declaration had set in motion, the systematic questioning of politicians and poets and craftsmen to find someone who was genuinely wiser, and the discovery, repeated across decades of conversation, that the people most confident of their knowledge were the least justified in that confidence. He spoke about his philosophical practice as a kind of service to the city, to the god, to the idea that the examined life was the only kind of life genuinely worth living. That phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living, arrived in the middle of the defense as a philosophical claim, not as a dramatic flourish. Socrates was not trying to be quotable. He was explaining, as clearly as he could, why he could not simply agree to stop asking questions in exchange for his acquittal. The jury had apparently offered something like this as a possibility, and he had declined, not from stubbornness but from philosophical consistency. A life without inquiry was not, to his understanding, a life he could inhabit. It was an emptying of what made life what it was. The philosophical practice and the living were not separable. To ask him to stop questioning in order to stay alive was to ask him to stop being the thing he was in order to preserve the shell of it. The jury voted to convict. The margin, by the account that has come down through Plato, was not enormous. A relatively small number of votes in the other direction, and the trial would have gone differently. But trials are decided by the votes that are actually cast, and Socrates was convicted, and then, in the penalty phase, sentenced to death. In the days that followed, while the execution was delayed by a religious festival that required the city to wait before carrying out the sentence, Socrates remained in his prison cell and talked. This is the scene the Phaedo records. the philosopher in his last hours, surrounded by friends who were visibly distressed, managing their grief with the same patient attention he had brought to every conversation before this one. He was not performing equanimity. The Phaedo makes this distinction carefully. There was genuine sorrow in the room, and Socrates acknowledged it and moved through it and continued to think. He spoke about the soul and about what might or might not persist beyond death, not as a man who was certain of the answer, but as a man who had spent his life in the practice of following the argument wherever it went, and who was prepared to follow it even here. The hemlock, when it came, was drunk without theatrics. The friends wept. Socrates told them, gently and with something close to affection, that there was no need. What the Phaedo preserves, in the quiet of the scene, is not the death of a martyr, but the last hours of a man whose soul, if Plato's own account of the soul has any validity, was already at rest in its own order. Reason governing, the spirited part quiet, appetite stilled, not by force but by a long practice of subordinating it to something it recognized as more important than itself, the just soul, meeting the end of its time in the world, resting in the harmony that Plato had defined as justice, internal, achieved, requiring nothing from outside to remain what it was. The question that Socrates had spent his life asking, what justice truly was, apart from reputation and reward and the arrangements of power, outlasted him by a distance that is still being measured. The students who had gathered around him carried the question in different directions. Plato built an entire metaphysical architecture around it, the tripartite soul, the ideal city, the form of the good that grounded justice in something beyond human agreement. Aristotle, who came to Plato's academy as a young man and stayed for 20 years before departing to work in his own direction, held the question differently. He was less interested in the transcendent form and more interested in what justice looked like in practice, in actual cities, among actual people, with actual competing interests that no ideal philosophical structure could entirely resolve. His version of justice had to do with proportion, with giving each person what was genuinely due to them, with the kind of equity that a community of people with shared purposes could sustain across time. The form and the practice, the ideal and the habitual, these two ways of holding the question have not been reconciled in the centuries since, and perhaps they were never meant to be reconciled, but only held in productive tension, each pressing against the other, neither dissolving. After Aristotle, the philosophical climate of Greece shifted. The city-state, which had been the natural unit of political and moral life for Greek philosophy, began to lose its self-sufficiency as larger empires spread across the Mediterranean world. And into this changed landscape came the Stoics, who picked up the Socratic question and carried it somewhere neither Plato nor Aristotle had quite reached. The Stoic philosophers, working first in Athens and then across several generations, extending their influence into Rome, were interested in what justice meant when the community you were thinking about was not a city, but the entire human species. This was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a philosophical argument with a specific structure. All human beings, the Stoics held, participate in the logos, the rational principle that runs through the world like a thread through a fabric, present in the structure of the cosmos, and present also, by virtue of their rationality, in the structure of every human mind. Because rationality is what all human beings share, the boundary of genuine community is not the wall of Athens or the shore of Greece or the edge of any political arrangement, but the outer limit of the species itself. Every human being belongs by their nature as a rational creature to a community that extends as far as rational creatures exist. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the Roman Empire in the 2nd century and wrote his philosophical reflections in a private journal that was never intended for an audience, a document that has nonetheless been read for nearly 2,000 years under the name Meditations, returned to this thought repeated in the way that a person returns to a thought they need to hold steady against the pressure of daily circumstances. He was an emperor. His daily circumstances included wars and plagues, and the administration of an enormous complexity of human need and conflict. And he returned in the evenings to his notebook and wrote things like this: that he was a citizen, not of Rome, but of the world, that the rational nature he shared with every other human being was the ground of a community no political arrangement could fully contain or fully exclude. Justice, on this account, was not the justice of Rome over its provinces. It was the justice owed by any rational being to any other rational being, everywhere, without exception, simply by virtue of what they both were. Epictetus, nod not sard sorely epictetopi, of Shidwadi by Tedenabet, who had been born into slavery, and who worked out his philosophical views under conditions that would have made the Stoic claim about internal freedom seem either deeply true or bitterly ironic, depending on how one came at it, arrived at essentially the same conclusion by a different path. The freedom that mattered, he argued, was not freedom from external constraint. That was a freedom no one could guarantee, but freedom from internal enslavement to things outside one's control. The body could be owned. The body could be moved from place to place, set to work, confined, harmed, but the rational faculty, the capacity to judge, to assent, to withhold assent, that was always, in principle, one's own. And justice, on this view, was the practice of governing oneself by that rational faculty, of recognizing the same rational nature in others and treating it accordingly. The just person was free in the way that mattered, regardless of the arrangements external power had made. This Stoic extension of the Socratic question, from the soul of the individual to the ideal city, to the entire human community, did not resolve the question. It expanded the field in which the question had to be answered, and the expansion left traces in philosophical and political traditions that would carry the argument into centuries Socrates could not have imagined. There is a letter written in a cell not unlike the one in which Socrates spent his last days that contains a sentence referring to the distinction between just and unjust laws. The letter was written in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963 by a man who had been imprisoned for participating in a civil rights demonstration. Martin Luther King Jr. was writing in response to a statement from a group of white clergymen who had urged the movement to slow down, to wait, to proceed through legitimate legal channels rather than in the streets. And King, in a letter that ran to several thousand words, replied with a philosophical precision that the clergymen had perhaps not expected. A just law, he wrote, is a man-made code that squares with the moral law, with the natural law. An unjust law is a code that degrades human personality. The obligation to obey law was conditional. It depended on whether the law, in its substance and its application, was grounded in something more than the will of those who held power. The obligation to disobey an unjust law was not a breakdown of civil order. It was a form of the highest civic responsibility, the responsibility to hold the arrangements of human power accountable to something deeper than themselves. This was not, in King's hands, a new argument. He knew its history. He cited Augustine. He cited Aquinas. He cited the natural law tradition that runs from ancient philosophy through centuries of moral and political thought. But beneath all of those citations, The argument is recognizable as an extension of the challenge that Thrasymachus had posed in the opening movement of Plato's Republic, the challenge that justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger, and of the counter-argument that Socrates had spent the rest of the conversation attempting to build. Thrasymachus had said, "The law is what power makes it." King had replied, "Across 25 centuries and a vast distance of historical circumstance. But power is not the measure of its own justice. There is a standard by which power is judged, and whether one calls that standard the form of the good, or the moral law, or the natural law, or the dignity inherent in rational nature, what it points toward is the same thing the Socratic question had always pointed toward, the existence of a justice that does not depend on who is enforcing it. The thread is real. It is not a metaphor or a convenience of narrative. The actual arguments connect across the centuries in traceable ways. The Stoic cosmopolis to the Roman legal tradition, the Roman legal tradition to the medieval natural law theorists, the natural law theorists to the Enlightenment conception of rights that do not originate in political arrangement, the Enlightenment conception to the tradition of civil disobedience that Thoreau had articulated and that King had deployed with philosophical as well as strategic care. These are not independent discoveries arriving at the same place by coincidence. They are a conversation extended across time in which each generation of serious thinkers inherited a version of the question and worked with it in the conditions they faced. And what persists underneath all of this, underneath the Platonic architecture and the Stoic cosmopolitanism and the natural law tradition and the letters written in cells, is something simpler than any of them. It is the act of asking, the willingness to sit with the question of what justice truly is, and not accept the first available answer, not the answer that serves whoever is currently in power, not the answer that makes the uncomfortable feeling go away, not the answer that was handed over by parents or poets or priests without examination. The actual question, put directly, held patiently, allowed to resist easy resolution. Socrates held it for a lifetime. He held it in conversations that ended in aporia, in the stiffness of genuine perplexity, in the uncomfortable suspension of a mind that has given up its easy certainties and has not yet found anything solid to replace them. He held it barefoot in the agora through decades of questioning, accumulating no answers in the sense that his interlocutors had hoped for, and accumulating something else, a practice, a faithfulness, a refusal to pretend to know what he did not know that was, in his own assessment, the beginning of whatever genuine wisdom might look like. And he held it, finally, in a prison cell in the spring of his last year, when the holding of it had cost him everything the city could take, and had left him in possession of what it could not. The equanimity of that last scene in the Phaedo is not a philosophical achievement performed for the benefit of posterity. It is, on Plato's account, the natural condition of a soul that has spent a long time in the right relationship with itself, reason governing, the spirited part at ease, appetite quiet, not through suppression, but through long practice of orienting toward what reason recognized as genuinely worth attending to, the harmony of the just soul, not imposed from outside, not dependent on external conditions, present in the cell, the way it had been present in the agora, the way it would have been present in the ideal city that Socrates and Glaucon and Edemontus had built. In words, through the long evening at Cephalus's house, requiring nothing other than itself to remain what it was. The question rests in this, for a moment, not answered, not closed, but resting. Outside the cave, the sun continues to do what Plato said the form of the good does, to cause things to exist and to cause them to be seen. Inside the cave, the shadows continue to move on the wall, cast by objects whose shapes the shadow watchers have not yet thought to look for. And somewhere between the wall and the entrance, there are people in the middle of the turning, the difficult, slow, uncomfortable process of reorienting toward the light, their eyes still adjusting, the brightness still more than they can fully bear, the real shapes of things still coming into focus, gradually, with the patience the process requires. This is not a story with an ending. The cave has an entrance, and the sun is outside it, and the turning is always in progress somewhere, in some life, in some conversation that begins with a question no one present can answer with confidence. The philosophers who came after Socrates built their architectures and extended their arguments and drew their distinctions and wrote their letters from their cells and walked away from the trial, having decided, each of them, whether justice was worth choosing for itself alone. Most of them decided yes, not because the argument was complete. The argument is not complete, because the alternative, the position that justice is only power, and power answers only to itself, and there is nothing beneath the arrangement of forces by which human beings are ordered. That position, when genuinely inhabited, rather than merely proposed as a debating point, tends to dissolve something in the person who holds it, something that the Stoics would have called the logos, something that Plato would have called the rational part of the soul, something that Socrates would have called simply the self that the examined life is trying to know. The question asked by a man standing barefoot in a marketplace, of generals who thought they understood courage, and politicians who thought they understood piety, and craftsmen who thought their skill in one domain had taught them something universal. That question has not been finally answered.